Okay, welcome APUSH students to your chapter 5. This right here is the Road to Rebellion. It's going to get us all the way up to 1776 and the Declaration of Independence from Britain. So let's go ahead and get in it. Okay. First part here. Understand that a lot of the cause of the Revolutionary War is going to come from the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, as it was also called. They have tremendous debt. And they've got to, for the first time in really the relationship between the colonies and Britain, they're going to directly tax the colonies. The colonies had paid taxes, but they paid them in the form of something called duties. So basically, when they bought something from Britain, then they were paying taxes on those goods, which went back to Britain. But that was something that you could choose. These taxes that are going to end up coming onto the colonists are going to be ones they can't choose, to get around. So that's really going to be a difference for them, and they're going to really get upset about it. Okay, so the British military, they've had to increase their presence in America after the 7 Years' War. They've got to prevent Native American rebellions, such as Pontiac's Rebellion. They got to try to enforce the Proclamation of 1763 to try to keep the colonists from expanding westward. Britain has spent far too much money. They've been pretty much in constant warfare for decades, even up to this point, and they don't want to spend more money putting down Indians. So they want the colonists to just chill out and relax and stay calm so that they don't have to deal with Indians. But of course, that's not going to happen. The colonists have different motives in mind. So George Grenville is the prime minister of Britain, the first one. They're going to go through a lot trying to deal with the colonies here. He's going to institute something called the Currency Act, which prohibited colonies from using paper money. And this really hamstrung them in their trade because they couldn't get their hands on a lot of hard currency. And so they would occasionally print their own paper money for use locally. So they're going to, come down on them for that. The Sugar Act gets a little bit worse. It increased the tax that ends up replacing a former act called the Molasses Act. Colonists are going to get around this by smuggling. Remember, because of the Navigation Acts passed in the late 1600s, that they couldn't trade with France. They couldn't buy the cheaper French molasses and stuff like that. So they had already started smuggling and doing that. The Sugar Act is going to increase a tax directly on it. So that's going to lead to smuggling. Basically, what you're going to see is the end of this period of time you need to know called salutary neglect, which ends in 1763, which is the end of the French-Indian War. So that year is very, very important. And another important aspect of the end of salutary neglect is that smugglers are going to be tried in vice admiralty courts, not local courts of their peers. Typically, smugglers would never be found guilty because it was kind of a wink, wink, nod, nod kind of thing. Everybody understands it's a dumb rule, so we're not going to put our own in jail. But now they're going to be tried in these courts that are basically British run, where the smugglers were guilty until proven innocent, and that's going to rile up the colonists, as you can imagine. They're already beginning to chafe at this increased British control. Remember, you've got to compare the colonies to a teenager that's had a taste of autonomy. A teenager that's 17, 18 years old, whose parents have been away for whatever reason, and they've kind of ran things themselves, and then all of a sudden parents come back into the picture wanting to run them, wanting to tell them what to do, and there's a natural tendency to buck against it. You've done fine on your own, and that's kind of what's going on here. After the Sugar Act comes an even worse act by the British called the Stamp Act, and this one is a direct tax. It's a tax on 50 commonly used goods. Colonists can't really get around it. I mean, you're tried. If you buy a newspaper, you got to pay a tax. Playing cards, you got to pay a tax. All these different items you're going to be taxed on. So there's no way for them to get around it. So it is very much a direct tax, which they felt was illegal. They didn't have representation in Britain, and so they didn't feel like they could be taxed. So you get the famous no taxation without representation. The British are going to respond to that charge by saying that the colonists are virtually represented, that there are people in Britain who speak for the colonists. That's not good enough for the colonists. They want their own say in things. Another really bad thing that the British do that really riles up the colonists is something called the Quartering Act. They're going to require colonists to feed and house British troops. This is a way of passing on the cost of British troops to the colonists rather than Britain itself paying for them. You can imagine how unhappy families were to house, young male soldiers in homes where they have teenage daughters and stuff like that. And you're having to pay for these young men. You're having to worry about these young men doing something to your daughters or something like that. So the Quartering Act is something that really, really upset the colonists. Okay. Now, moving forward just a little bit, 1765 to 1770. We're getting closer to that date, 1776. We get a formal protest, and you're starting to see riots. You're starting to see the crowd swell up. So the House of Burgesses protested the Stamp Act. Patrick Henry, he's going to step up, and he's eventually going to be the guy who says, give me liberty or give me death. But remember, the colonists are not, there is no thought of independence. There's no thought of leaving Britain. They're just wanting Britain to fix their stuff. They want to be left alone is what they want. The colonists don't want Britain interfering. They feel like Britain's got a good thing going with them and that the colonists have a good thing going. Why mess it up? So the colonists, they institute something called the Stamp Act Congress as a response to the Stamp Act. And they believe that only colonial representatives could tax colonists, not Parliament. And that's what I've told you, no taxation without representation. You get the formation of a locally grown terrorist group called the Sons of Liberty. We view them as heroes, but from the British perspective, of course, they were just terrorists is all they were. They protested the act. They even attacked royal officials. They were probably the most successful when they boycotted British goods. They were also responsible for the tarring and feathering of stamp collectors and things like that. They intimidated, they scared, they tore down stamp collector officials' homes and mansions and stuff like that, to the point where every single one, I think there were something like 50 different stamp collectors, all resigned. They were too afraid. They were unwilling to try to collect the taxes. And that's the Sons of Liberty operating in pseudo secrecy, but a lot of people knew who their big names were. And they're a terrorist group. Large protests did lead many British officials resigning their positions, like I said. And let's understand the ideological roots of resistance. Why in the heck are the colonists all of a sudden fed up with things? You're looking at 150 years that the colonies have been in the New World. Why now? Well, English common law argued that as subjects of the British monarchy, colonists deserve certain rights. They are colonists. They are subjects of the British monarchy. They want the same English common law that you get if you live in Britain. The Enlightenment was also a massive influence. These ideas such as natural rights and separation of powers, the ideas that that a government governs at the consent of the people, these John Locke ideas. It's big. Our founding fathers are huge in the Enlightenment. You also had a group in Parliament called the Whigs who were favorable to colonists, and they have really, I like their outlook. They believe why rile the colonists up? The best thing we have going with the colonists is trade. We make a lot of money off the colonies and this lucrative trade we have with them. We need to try to get our money somewhere else. Don't rile them up. It's not worth a fight. Many of those ideas spread rapidly in newspapers and pamphlets. So again, you're going to have people like Ben Franklin, who owns a newspaper there in Pennsylvania. He's going to help spread the ideas. Paul Revere and others like that as well. Still, in 1770, still no independence. We're not thinking about independence. We're just fed up. We want rights. You might compare it to, say, modern day women's movement, modern day minority movements. Nobody's wanting to be broke apart. They're looking for more equality, more rights. Okay, many colonists compared themselves to slaves since they did not give consent to British laws. And a few of the colonies, where you're first going to see some of the colonies really start challenging slavery. Quakers such as Ben Franklin, James Otis, who start to see, hey, We don't like the way this feels. I imagine the slaves don't like their lives either. Now, Parliament and the Patriots would end up squaring off several times. Britain would end up repealing the Stamp Act in 1766. So it doesn't last but for about a year. And they say, okay, that's a terrible idea, too much hassle. So we're going to repeal it. We're going to take it back. Oops, our bad. We're taking it away. But at the same time that they repealed the Stamp Act, they passed something called the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act says that Parliament could pass any law in the future. They don't want to start a precedent of the colonies. Anytime they don't like a law Britain passes and they give a little bit of resistance, Britain's going to cave. They can't do that. So when they repealed the Stamp Act, they let the colonists know, just so you know, we're the boss and we can pass any law we want in the future. Just get your mind around it. Now, George Grenville, he's out, and a new prime minister steps in, Charles Townshend. He is not sympathetic to the colonists, and he's going to pass a host of acts that are collectively known as the Townshend Acts. He taxes paper, paint, glass, tea, and these taxes would pay the salaries of imperial officials because, remember, back in the day, imperial officials were paid by the colonists, and so they were very sympathetic to the colonists because they were the ones paying their paychecks. So he knows that, so he wants to take money from the colonists and use it to pay the officials. Colonists resisted those taxes as well. So you get a second boycott. The most successful aspect of colonial resistance wasn't violence. It was the economic boycotts. When they refused to buy British goods, when they made homespun clothing, when they made homemade tea, this is when the colonists were really hurting the British, because the British merchants who were going bankrupt over there are losing their minds, and they're putting pressure on the British politicians. So this is really where they get some good traction. You also get the rise of the Daughters of Liberty. And the Daughters of Liberty are very important because they're making that homespun clothing. They're making that tea. There are even women in this time period who, for the first time, are writing political pamphlets that are being published in newspapers. So women are, because of the Enlightenment, women are slowly starting to gain a voice. Ben Franklin advocated returning to pre-1763 policies. That's his idea of fixing it. That's what he's trying to get across to Britain. Hey, listen, let's just go back to the way it was before 1763, the end of the war. That's when things went south. You guys started getting crazy. Let's just go back to the way it was before this gets out of hand. Well, it's going to get out of hand. There's going to be troops sent to Boston, and Boston is kind of one of the main areas of resistance. Both sides are stubbornly dug in with their beliefs, and so they are going to send these soldiers to Boston, and that is going to be a terrible, terrible idea. Now, we got problems in the West. Again, many of these frontier colonists favor westward expansion. They want new land. They want opportunities. You got squatters out there who aren't buying land. They're just out there claiming land. And no imaginary line on a map is going to stop them. But Britain's beginning to view the proclamation line as permanent. Again, they don't want the added money of having to fight the Indians. However, we got a new prime minister. Townshend's out. Too much stress. There's a lot of bickering and fighting going on in Parliament back in Britain. And Prime Minister Lord North convinced Parliament to repeal the Townshend Acts. However, they leave the tax on tea. Meanwhile, you've got about 16,000, or you've got about 4,000 British soldiers in a town of 16 to 20,000. Boston was at the time. They're poorly paid soldiers. Many of the soldiers are competing locally for second jobs. And it's really the first time, because the people of Boston have always considered themselves British until the real British show up. They realize when the real British, the redcoats, show up and walking around, that they're different. We are not the same. The culture is still different between Britain and Bostonians. And there's going to be a lot of resentment and ill content towards those soldiers. March 5th, 1770, you get something called the Boston Massacre, a conflict which ended up killing 4 colonists. And we'll look at it in a little more detail in class. It's not a massacre. It's not what you would think of as a massacre for colonists, but that's propaganda. That's colonial propaganda to rile people up. And to be fair, it's really started by the colonists. They go down there, spooling for a fight, and they get one, and they end up getting several of them getting killed. But again, it does serve as propaganda for patriots. People are beginning to see the colonies as something different than Britain. Now, like it says here, most colonists were loyal and absolutely do not want independence. They just don't. You have several groups that are very loyal to Britain. There were these elite merchants whose sole trading was with Britain, and they knew who buttered their bread. And so they're going to be loyal. You've got the Anglican clergy, the Church of England here in the colonies. They are absolutely loyal to Britain. And then you got any colonists who had royal jobs. They had a job where Britain was basically cashing their check. They're loyal to Britain as well. Most of the farmers, they don't see the big fuss. They're out there. It's not a big deal to them. So they tend to be fairly loyalist as well. Really, the people who are really upset are your traders, your mid-level traders, your leaders in America. These people who've been running the show, and now all of a sudden here comes Britain wanting to come in and push them around. This is not a grassroots rebellion, the American Revolution. It just isn't. Okay, our final 5 years here, the road to independence. We get something called the Continental Association. We're grouping together now as colonies, although we're still not all on the same page. But it did encourage a third boycott against British goods. How are we going to handle this? Do we fight? No, we don't want to fight. What can we do? Well, let's boycott them again. Just let them know we're serious. Southern planters feared dependency. Many Virginia farmers were in debt to British merchants. They don't want to be in debt. And Virginia feared that Britain could punish them like they had Massachusetts when they took away Massachusetts' charter and created the Dominion of New England. So they're afraid of that. You had loyalists and neutrals. Some patriot leaders, such as Sam Adams, were accused of serving their own interest. There's probably a little bit of that. There's a massive debate right now in this country in the late 1700s. That's sort of like today. How much is too much rights? How much is masculine toxicity and things like that? People are debating these things today. It's the same way back then. Yeah, Sam, you're talking a big game about how Britain is doing this and Britain's doing that. But in reality, you want Britain out of the picture because it serves your best interest. You're no America or anything like that. It's just all about you, Sam. Some people are accusing him of that. The loyalists were the people who remain loyal to Britain, and they're about 20% of the population. There are many neutrals, and there are some patriots. About 20% they don't want to fight. They don't want to leave Britain. Britain is the greatest empire on earth, and they're just not ready to leave. All right, we finally get armed resistance in Massachusetts. We get the famous Minutemen. These men, they're militia. They're farmers who have trained a little bit, who are going to be ready to fight in a minute's notice. And the patriots that would warn of conflict with the British. Well, we got conflicts coming. So the British land in Boston. They put Boston after the Boston Tea Party, which I didn't see on this slide. So let me fill you in on the Boston Tea Party because you need to know it. I'm not sure why it's not on the PowerPoint. So Lord North, Prime Minister, says, okay, we're going to sell the tea directly to the colonists, and we're going to bypass colonial merchants. That way the tea is cheaper to the colonists, but we're still getting the benefits. Well, that angered the colonial merchants, who are the middlemen. So they dress up as it's basically a Sons of Liberty operation. They dress up as Iroquois Indians. They go onto those boats and they throw about $1 million worth of tea into the Boston Harbor, and they refuse to pay for it. And they're saying, "Oh no, that wasn't us. That was Indians. We can't control Indians." And the British are like, "Yeah, we're not stupid. We know it was you." When they won't pay, Britain responds by putting Boston under martial law. So now the Bostonians are pretty ticked off, and they're beginning to gather weapons. And news of that hits General Gage, Thomas Gage, who's in charge of Boston. And so he gets some troops together and they march on Lexington and Concord. At Lexington, they are met with a bunch of Minutemen, and the British tell them to disperse, order them to disperse. Somebody fires a shot. We don't know who exactly. Could have been the colonies. It could have been Britain. We don't know, but it is known as the shot heard round the world because it starts this rebellion. It starts the Revolutionary War, which puts America into the world history picture. And you look at the impact America's made on world history because of this. Without that shot, it's possible that we don't ever go to war with Britain. And we serve as one of their colonies for a long, long time, maybe like India did. All right. Second Continental Congress, let me tell you. So they kill a couple of Minutemen and they keep going on. They go to the barn where supposedly the weapons were. The weapons have been moved. They got word of the British coming. The weapons have been moved. So they turn around and they head back to Boston. Well, they get nailed by Minutemen who are basically revenging the ones who were killed. And a bunch of them come up from the countryside and they enact significant damage on the British troops. They basically trap the British troops in Boston. We got an issue right here. This is big. This is a big deal. 1775. So the Second Continental Congress begins organizing for war because they don't like the odds of King George not retaliating. So they appoint George Washington as head of the colonial army. He's pretty much everybody's choice to do so. And so the Congress gives one last chance. They send something called the Olive Branch Petition to King George III. This is the last chance. They're hoping. They know it's not going. They know he's not going to accept it, but they send it and they say, "Listen, things have gotten out of hand. We would love to remain in the British Empire. You don't want war. We don't want war. Can we fix this?" Well, he rejects it because he's had his soldiers killed and he is fed up with the colonies. And so he deems them to be in a state of rebellion and he's going to send troops to put us down. Now, in the South, the fighting's a little bit different. The British are going to promise to free slaves that would come help the British army. This isn't humanitarian. This is pragmatic. They know that slaves help the Southern economy tremendously. This angers many slave owners, though, who might have been loyalists before, and it strengthened the Patriot cause in the South, which was kind of a bit weaker than it was in the New England colonies. Remember, the New England colonies have had their charters taken away. They were forced into the Dominion of New England. Their religious dominance of the Puritans have been stripped away. They've had to shelter British troops in Boston. New England's been fed up. That's all been a little bit further away for the South. So for them, it's not as big of a deal. Now it is. Now the British have done something that they see as a direct threat, and they're in. It's like they're saying, okay, we're good. You got us. The South is in. We're with you, New England. Occupying Kentucky, Daniel Boone is going to occupy newly independent areas of Kentucky. Why is that important? That they're ignoring the British. They're going west of the proclamation line of 1763. They just don't care. They do not care. All right, last slide. All right, we get this guy. He's an important person to know. It's Thomas Paine. He's one of our founding fathers as well. He writes a very important pamphlet, about 46 pages long, called Common Sense. He writes it in January of 1776. So we're just months away from the Declaration of Independence. He accuses King George III of several wrongdoings. He does so in very plain language. He doesn't write like, an educated man. He writes so that the farmers can understand, so that the farmers can buy in. He uses biblical sayings and stuff like that. He very famously says, it makes no sense for a continent to be ruled by an island 3,000 miles away. It's got a good point there. He urges America to declare independence. It is time. We are finally, it takes until 1775, but the colonies have finally come to the point where they've decided, you know what? We do need to be something different. And he says, a government of our own is our natural right. 'Tis time to part. And it was time. It was time to leave. All right. Independence is declared. The Declaration of Independence was inspired by common sense, and very much by the Enlightenment. There are a lot of John Locke ideas in there. There's Voltaire, there's Rousseau, all of our famous Enlightenment thinkers of Europe. It's crossed the pond. Thomas Jefferson and others have been lapping it up. They've been reading it. Jefferson's going to be the primary writer of the Declaration of Independence. He was always sort of enemies with John Adams, but John Adams, as much as he didn't like Thomas Jefferson, came to Jefferson and said, "It needs to be you. Nobody writes like you. We need you to write this." So Jefferson and other people wrote about an idea called popular sovereignty, where the power rests with the people, not the government. And America is going to be this fantastic experiment. And Europe is going to wait for us to fall on our face. They expect us to fall on our face after we win the Revolutionary War. It doesn't happen. It was close. It wasn't great in the beginning. And we're going to talk about that. But this is the road to revolution. What you see is maybe the biggest cause of all is the French and Indian War. You've got this increase of taxes. You've got people already reading about Enlightenment ideas. Um, you've got the end of salutary neglect, and then they start directly taxing us with the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Acts, and the Currency Act, and the Quartering Act. Our response to that, of course, is smuggling and boycotting, which is fairly successful, but the British keep applying the pressure. And when they put those troops in Boston, which leads to the Boston Massacre, and then the Boston Tea Party, we've gone too far. And finally, we can't handle it anymore. July 4th, 1776, after we've already had bloodshed at Lexington and Concord, we're going to declare independence, and we're going to fight. And that's what the next chapter is going to be about. We're going to see how the freaking colonies takes on the world's greatest empire and somehow wins. So we'll see you next week.